You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Okay, so, we'll just get started. Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by me, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We know that there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're putting the show out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you, and this is kind of unique because once again we're doing this together.
Right. We're doing this live from Maryland.
Yeah, exactly.
So, very good to be together again. I think this is the third or fourth episode this season, or maybe the third or fourth episode that we've recorded live since the show started. But tonight we're looking at Star Trek: The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 5, Loud as a Whisper, which debuted on January 9th, 1989. I really like this episode for multiple reasons. I think there's a lot of great acting, but I was wondering what you thought of the episode before we got into it.
Again, it follows the same pattern. We're in season 2. The stories are much tighter, and there's a couple interesting points where they get the mission of picking up this mediator that we're there to take to mediate the end of hostilities that have gone on for decades, if not centuries, between these two parties on Solaris 5. And, one of the things I noted is that Picard at one point says it's not our job to police the galaxy, but then it gets into some of the discussions we've had about, what is the actual mission of the Enterprise. It can change in the situation. And it's like when Picard says it's not our job to police this galaxy, then why does he ask Troy to fill in for Riva as we get into the story once Riva is compromised in some way? And again, the other thing that shows up is the burgeoning closer relationship between Picard and Riker, because it starts out in the beginning of the episode where Picard is in his ready room observing a model of some orbital mechanics, a puzzle of orbital mechanics, and Riker shows up and he it says at one point to Riker, cluck, 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 number 1. So it's kind of this lightheartedness between the two of them.
Right.
So,
so as you said, the crew of the Enterprise D is on the way to Solaris 5 to help mediate a long-standing war between the Solarians, using the help of a famous mediator named Riva, who is from the planet Ramatus 3. So, one thing that I found really interesting, and we can just kind of jump right into it, the main problem here is that basically, the Solarians have been facing off against each other in sectarian violence for so long, they will actually destroy themselves for too long if they do not find some way to mediate, which is why they brought Riva from his planet of Ramatus 3 to help figure out a peace treaty. I find the setup for this episode interesting in terms of the Solarians because, stepping away for a second about the Federation being the galaxy's police force, it seems odd to me that if the Solarians know that they are heading towards destruction, and a mutual destruction, that they actually need a mediator in the first place to figure this out. But it seems as though that while the Federation isn't necessarily the police force, um, it does seem, however, to be the governing body in the Alpha Quadrant that somehow facilitates or mediates. Maybe police force isn't the right term, or even a peacekeeping society. Um, but I think you highlight something very odd here in terms of it's very clear that the crew says we're not a police force, but what happens in this? Even
Right.
as you mentioned, going as
Right.
far to like employ Counselor Troy as a potential stand-in for Reva. Um, you know, what do you think about uh, when we first meet Reva when we get down to Ramesses 3, we discover that Reva is actually deaf, played by the great actor Howie Seago.
Who's actually really deaf.
Yeah, who is actually a deaf actor. Um, it turns out Reva is actually is somewhat empathic based on his conversation with Troy, who is half telepathic or half empathic because she's half Beta Z. I'm sorry, Betazoid. He can also read lips, but the interesting thing about Reva is his actual like presentation to the crew when they first meet him. He actually employs three, I guess, kind of translators.
Voices, yeah.
Well,
Right.
there's one called the Scholar,
Right.
which is of course his learning and intellect. There's one that's called Passion, which is libido and his role as a warrior, and there's another one which is taken up by the role of a woman called Harmony and Wisdom. And it seems that for specific instances, Reva communicates through these individuals to, I guess, express certain moods or certain ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not Reva himself who's part of, who is the mediator. He's actually formed kind of like this performance with the rest of them.
And he must have, telepathy, telepathic communication with these three translators.
I think that is what is assumed here. It's very odd, actually, when they talk about Reva's powers, because on one hand he is empathic, it seems, and he can communicate with these people. But when he actually loses them later on, when they're unfortunately killed in a skirmish on Solea 5, when they finally beam down to meet and start the peace process, um, it seems as though he can't communicate with anyone else telepathically or empathically, even Troy. Like, he can communicate with Troy, but it seems as though it only works where Reva can communicate with fellow telepaths. He can't just beam his thought into your head. Because if he could, he wouldn't need these three to begin with.
Well, and it doesn't indicate in the story how long the translators, to use that term for them, have been together with Reva. So if it's been, it's the implication that they've been together for a long time. So whatever telepathic communication they've developed is probably matured and become very efficient over the years. So when the translators are unfortunately killed, and Reva can still communicate telepathically or empathically with Troy, it just isn't the same because they're not tuned in, and that's where sign language, the use of sign language and data learning sign language becomes very key to the whole story.
Well, one thing this episode does very well is put forward the idea and the truth that even if you are dealing with some sort of disability, whether it's physical or in terms of some sort of developmental issue, you can still be a functioning, contributing member of the greater intergalactic society. And I think one thing that I find interesting about Reva in general is it seems that though this office is actually, it seems like Reva is actually an office, that there's been more than one Reva beforehand, because it seems as though, it seems the way that the crew talks about him and the way that he's revered, that he's pretty well known throughout the galaxy as a peace mediator. So I would imagine, given his age, he's been doing this relatively young. I mean, the actor is a relatively young man. It wouldn't be out of the possibility that Riva may actually be like a transitional or a transitioning role that someone in that society takes to continue going out throughout the galaxy and harboring peace.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if every Riva before this one is deaf, and if every Riva before this one is deaf, how old is this setup of the scholar, the of passion and harmony, and if it has been set up for a long time, have wouldn't everyone kind of know about these three, the coming along with him and knowing that Riva's deaf, and you know it seems to me there's a lot of things that are just kind of left now that we're talking about a lot of things with the character of Riva and like his function that are kind of just thrown together throughout the episode, because once he loses his three interpreters, he basically becomes inconsolable until they figure out a very well, Troy helps him find out a very ingenious way to use his disability to bring peace to the Salayans, which we'll get to. But it just makes me wonder if this is a role within a society or something specified to him.
Well, that's a good question and point, because it said at one point that Riva's deafness is a genetic issue.
Right.
So, we don't know what his, on his planet and his particular species is, if he's perfectly Homo sapiens, so forth, but we don't know what his age lifespan is. So, but if if it's genetic, then his father, his ancestors should have carried that gene, so they may have been deaf too,
Mm-hmm.
which is not uncommon in humans now.
Yeah.
So it's one of those situations we've talked about. It sometimes they develop characters in these Star Trek episodes and stories where, they have to create the character so that it's part of the story, but there's just not enough time to provide the backstory and so forth.
Right.
Where did this individual come from? How did they evolve and so on?
Well, I think one thing, and we can kind of touch on it now. The way we are watching these episodes is traditionally very different from how we would have watched them when they first came out.
Mm-hmm.
These are 43 to 45 minute episodes with 12 to 15 minutes for commercial breaks. With the advent of Netflix and Amazon and streaming today, we can watch the episode throughout the entire 43 to 45 minutes
With no breaks, yeah.
with no breaks. So I think in some ways, having to consolidate the storytelling down in terms of saving time for broadcast, I think one thing that we'll probably see as we keep going on through the season is that they're either going to get much smarter about covering these kind of things, or I think we're moving away from kind of just having these characters that are just kind of placed there and never seen again, because you can kind of world build around that and then not have to put a lot of effort into it, because if you never see them again, what's really the issue. But I think now, especially since some of the future episodes this season, we'll see characters who come back in seasons 3, 4, 5, all the way through 7. This might be one of those episodes where there is a transition going on between Roddenberry and Berman in terms of who's producing, and the writing staff's changing too. I think one thing that might be happening, we're watching it here, is we're watching kind of more discipline paid towards characters in terms of how they're like you said, how they're shaped and how they're formed.
Right.
So one interesting thing that I find, why is Worf concerned about Riva creating a situation in which the Klingons then had a word for peace? From the Federation and human perspective, doesn't the idea of the Klingon language developing a word for peace, is that a positive evolution for the Klingons? I think that, that really does come down to basically what we're asking at home, folks, is Worf says Reva brought the word peace to the Klingons, and
It didn't exist before.
it didn't exist before him. What does that say about the Klingons? I think if you have a warlike race, the idea of actually having some sort of stand down in arms is probably a very difficult moment culturally. And we can actually get into this topic because it'll come back in this season, because there's a lot of Klingon episodes this season.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that a lot of fans talk about when it comes to the Klingon Empire starting in Next Generation is that this might actually be a society in decline. And if you look at it from the perspective of this is a warlike society that puts all of their cultural emphasis on war and being warriors, but they're not fighting wars with the Federation. Like, they've stopped doing that a long time ago. They're really not fighting a war with the Romulans. What we know internally is that the Klingons, however, are fighting with each other a lot, and they're having a lot of internal political squabbles. And we saw in a previous episode, I think it was called Heart of Glory, where those two Klingons were brought on board, who tried to escape the Empire so they could go to a remote planet and live, quote unquote, in a more Klingon manner, a more pure Klingon fashion.
Right.
I think one thing that might be happening here, and I think this plays out later in DS9 with Gowron, when Gowron's finally Chancellor, but the Klingons are slowly losing their society because the impetus to keep fighting wars has worn out for them. And I think that they are so desperately trying to, and I don't just think that, I think a lot of fans think this, they're so desperately trying to hold on to their society, their warlike society, that it's actually all falling around them. And maybe the entire idea of Reva coming and teaching them the word peace was one of those first steps for the downfall of their society. Where for us, it would be a positive thing that the Klingons are learning to put down their batliths and, power down the disruptors on the birds of prey. But what does this mean for Klingons? And do you have any reflections on that? Because you've always been a fan of the Klingons.
Yeah, I think that if you're a pure warrior, you don't see a draw. You either beat your enemy or you are beaten by the enemy. It's win-lose. And it seems like there's this evolution in the galaxy where different species are coming in contact with one another. And there's, exchange of ideas and so on. And they will have conflicts. They'll actually get into wars, or they'll act. The Klingons treated the Federation as adversaries for a long time until there was a peace treaty, and there had to be some realization that the conflict just wasn't beneficial. So once they start to realize that, well, there's a third way, that you neither win or lose, you negotiate with somebody, and you may not be friends with them, but you have an agreement so that you're not spending energy trying to kill one another, then that's where the idea of peace came in. And from a human perspective, you could say that, the Klingons being exposed to that concept and accepting it would be a positive thing. But as you said, if the Klingon culture still is purely warrior, that is in real conflict with what they have been. So if they don't have external enemies anymore, then, as you said, then they're going to end up taking
Against each other.
That need for have conflict against each other then.
Well, I think it's also seen in Worf, where Worf is always in conflict with himself as well.
Very much so.
Pardon me. I think one aspect of Klingons that we never really appreciate is that, it's always been set up that the Klingons could always be the natural enemies of the Federation, But the Klingons are in this constant conflict with the Romulans too, and we really
Right.
never talk about, and the show itself never really addresses the nature of the Federation's alliance with the Klingon Empire due to the Romulans.
Mm-hmm.
Because in some ways, it feels like traditionally the Klingons were just, and going back to Star Trek Six, The Undiscovered Country, the Klingons were definitely made to look like the Russians in Star Trek 6 and that was a very closed society until the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Right.
I think I think part of what Star Trek is dealing with and has been dealing with since the end of the Cold War is that the Klingons might be the Russians modernizing. And just like in the real world, the Russians have not had the best time figuring out how to work necessarily in a modernized world post the Soviet Union, maybe the Klingons are going through those exact same growing pains.
Growing pains not might be the best word, but adjustments to a new reality.
True. Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. So jumping around real quick. Oh, putting in this and what we just talked about, the Klingons in peace, putting this into contrast with the Selayan parties, which they're constantly in this strife with each other to the point where they need to negotiate, or they're going to lose their world or lose their societies. In some ways, this feels like science fiction because I don't even, and I know there's notes in here about Israel and Palestine, but it doesn't seem like this is a situation like Israel and Palestine because there is a sense that, like, at some point, and I think, it's it's the end of May 2021. Ben, if you're listening to this at home later on, Israel and Palestine had another conflict over the last few weeks that resulted in a large swath of destruction, too many people dead. And one of the things, and hopefully by the time you listen to this when you're older, things will be different, but they're essentially what's at odds here between the nation of Israel and Palestine is the question of who deserves to live on a certain piece of land. And one side believes that this side is the natural inheritors of the land because of God, and this side believes that they are the natural inheritors of the land because they were there. And unfortunately, it's caused decades and decades of violence and strife and death and destruction that a lot of people had to suffer from. I think the difference here is that, like, the Salayans are finally at that point where they've been fighting for so long that, they can't stop, and if they don't stop, they're dead. It feels like with Israel and Palestine, at least, there's at least a movement for that. Like, they at least cease fire. At least they establish ceasefires. It seems like in this episode, the Salayans never got to that point where, like, neither side ever looked and said, "See, we need to have a ceasefire," or something like that. It seems like they're just constantly going.
Right. I think that's the
And it's a closed planet, too. So,
yeah,
like,
I think that's the key part of the story where the Salayans had been, fighting for decades, centuries, whatever, and that they realized that they were so habituated to it in their thinking and behavior that unless they had an external negotiator come in, they were going to end up destroying themselves. So there was a matter of desperation among the two parties that they really wanted Riva to come. And even when, Riva came down to the planet and they had their first encounter, and there was one of the Salayan groups who, one of them was not in favor of it, and he ended up, killing the three translators of Riva and, setting up a problem for Riva. And Riva and the Enterprise crew being back up. The one Salayan party who actually killed or disintegrated his partner who had killed the translators after Riva had left said, "Riva, we really need you."
yeah.
So there was desperation there. And I think that one of the things that happened after Riva worked things through with Troy and figured out how he could remain effective, Riva finally realized and says that the key to negotiations is getting the parties to listen to one another. And, you talk about the Israel and the Palestinians, particularly those Palestinians in Gaza, they listen to one another. But the problem there is that there's not a shared agenda
Right.
that they can agree on. It's over land, it's over human rights, it's over economics and so forth. But there's no common thought as to how they could make things better. Where in this situation, the Chilean parties are so desperate, they know that they have to make things better by figuring out how to come to stop fighting.
Right. Well, I think one aspect of that is I think what's missing there is you need to have a unified story. And you and I have talked about this off air recently. You really can't figure out a way to unify and make peace unless you can all agree that you're going to tell a story of everything that comes afterwards that reflects that kind of peace and harmony you're wishing to establish. It's literally telling a different story of, once upon a time we started fighting, and then at this point the fighting got so bad that we stopped, and from here on forward we lived in peace. You have to have a unified vision of that part where, we stopped fighting, we lived in peace afterwards. But everyone has to be on board with that. Everyone has to be in some sort of agreement, even if they have to give up things to achieve that. And it seems that it's not only a question of listening, but it's also a question of being able to empathize, because if you both share the same story, you can see each other, you can see yourself in each other. It seemed like even the Solans don't even have that ability to do that in a way that they need a third party. And I think it says something interesting about maybe what the writers think about conflict. That even when you have a species that is relatively closed off from the galaxy, that everyone is the same species, looks the same, you can still have these things that drive you apart to the point of, almost genocidal animus.
Well, I think you're saying something very important, because here we are in Maryland, and Fran and Dave's house, and there's a copy of I think it's April Atlantic magazine, and there's an article in there talking about the current political climate in the United States.
Yeah.
And it says one of the problems is we don't have a common story anymore.
Oh yeah.
And that really is. I read that article briefly, and it's like, yeah, that's really true. That's why the political divisions and the social and even what's becoming cultural divisions are just so immense right now.
Well, the only thing that I can make an analogy to, I'm a big reader of history. Sometimes it looks a lot like the end of the Roman Empire, because what people a lot of people have a lot of different ideas about why Rome fell and why it turned out the way it did. And I might get large parts of what I'm about to say wrong, but essentially Rome became too big that it was unable to properly manage its entire territory, but it was also, when you have a territory and empire that big, cultures inside of that empire grow on their own, and you may have two different cultures grow up within the same sovereignty that are completely opposed to each other, and in the end will bring about a kind of civil war or conflict with each other. Rome, in many ways, split culturally between East and West.
Yes, exactly.
Where
Rome and Constantinople.
Well, and Rome was so big that, like, Rome and Western Europe had its own distinct set of challenges that were completely different from what the Eastern Empire had to deal with.
And I think that what happened when they kind of split, the Western Empire really became more chaotic, as where the Eastern Empire stayed much more organized.
Well, the Eastern Empire had to stay much more organized because they had to be the buffer between the Middle East and the Far East
Right.
in terms of things like the Huns and other invading forces coming to the West like they did. And eventually they do fail, and certain groups like the Huns sweep into Western Europe. But, I think what happens is that you get something that's so big and so immense that even all the people inside of it, even if you have this gigantic federation of billions of people living on millions of planets, at some point it becomes so unmanageable that not everyone can communicate with each other. And I think part of the issue that we're dealing with, kind of getting away from the episode and getting into the real world, is that not only do we not have a unified story, but there's so many different places you can go and talk amongst yourselves. And part of this is the internet, part of it's social media. But like you could go to one news channel and hear a completely different culture
Yes, for
from
sure.
this news
Right.
channel, or you could go to this part. Part of it is like not only having a unified story and having a unified language, but you also have to have somewhat of a unified view. And I think like just like the just like we're having a different view here in America, and the Israeli and Palestinians have had a different view of how to handle the Levant since the foundation of Israel. I think what we're dealing with here is we have a language, we know how to communicate to each other, we know how to tell a story. We now just have to see that story in the same way. And I think that's very, very difficult because we all see a story in a very different way in terms of who are the heroes and who are the villains. Riva has to come down and convince everyone that there are no heroes, there are no villains, there are just people fighting. And that's a very difficult story to tell when you're not the one who's having to tell it. You're having to get someone else to do it.
And getting into the story, that's where the solution really works because, where does it say that somebody says,
Oh, yeah. So what happens?
he realizes that he needs to turn a disadvantage into an advantage.
Troy helps him see that.
Troy helps him see that. So he realizes, and Data has
A big
role in this because after the translators are killed and the communication between Troy and Riva is not complete, they realize that Riva does use sign language. So Data goes onto the ship's computer and learns
sign
14 different versions of sign language, becomes an expert in it. So he's able to communicate completely with Riva. And then Riva realizes the way to almost distract the two Chilean parties away from their conflict is to say, you want me to, end the hostilities, negotiate a settlement, then you're going to have to learn the sign language. And that's going to take those two parties months to do. So it's almost like Jedi magic where he's
almost, yeah.
He's deflecting them from their hostility, and they're going to have to concentrate on how to learn to sign with him, and then they have something in common that they've done with him.
Well, they have to learn how to perceive him together because he is going to teach them something they don't know.
Right, exactly.
And I agree with you. I actually think that the end when Troy helps Riva figure out how to turn the disadvantage of his deafness into a positive so he can help the Chileans, I think that is a really clever way to bring about the end of this episode and figure out the problem.
And I think there's a good message kind of not too far below the surface, just saying that because this is when 89 they were started to be, I think it was during Bush that the American Disabilities Act took place. So it wasn't too long after this that was passed into law. And that one of the things that the message that's in this episode is that individuals with disabilities can make major contributions to society.
Yeah.
As you said before, when Jordy and Riva have a conversation, because Riva's interested in Jordy's disability with the visor and so forth. And he says that, they say to each other that each is special in his own way.
Yeah.
So I think that's a important kind of societal message that maybe gets through to some people from this episode.
Well, I think it's knowing a lot of people who've had to deal with disabilities and challenges of all sorts, including myself. You would know this, of course, but being deaf from the time I was born until I was 3 because of fluid in my ears, I could have ended up having learned sign, but thankfully I was lucky enough to get tubes by the time that came around. I think that the scene with Reva and Jordy is very special because it points out how people with disabilities really do have to learn to take this large disadvantage that they're dealt with, and whether through technology or behavioral therapies or special education, they really do have to figure out how to get up to the same level as us in terms of us being able to do all the not having to face any of the disabilities they face. They have to not only get to our level, but then at the same time be expected to somehow overachieve. And I think the important thing here with this scene is that Reva looks at Jordy and Jordy looks at Reva and says, despite our challenges, we have figured out how to do this. And what makes us special is not necessarily our tools, but our ability to work past the things that we've had to work past.
Right, exactly.
I think for Reva, the visor is neat because it gives Jordy back something that he necessarily doesn't have. Reva has to interpret the world and interpret for people through these 3 people. And even when he goes on that date with Troy, because it's very clear that he and Troy go on a date, the libido, the person who plays passion or libido has to come with them. That has to be very difficult. I think if you're trying to pick up a woman, you have to have this third wheel with you the entire time talking for you. And even Reva says until we learn how to communicate with each other, he has to be here.
Right.
I think it was just, in terms of Jordy and Reva, very good message. But let's get into Jordy real quick, because I actually wanted to talk to you about this one. So,
one thing about Jordy, he, even when he got the visor, since his has a different, can sense a broader magnetic spectrum. I think we've had an episode previous as to a view, because Picard became fascinated in everything that Jordy can see. So Jordy had to learn to interpret, what change vision, unnatural vision, in a sense, he would get from the visor.
Right.
So he had to adapt also.
Right. Well, I wanted to get into that. So one thing that happens in this episode is that Jordy is constantly suffering pain because of the visor as a prosthesis for his eyes. He goes to Dr. Pulaski, who says that she can actually, and has apparently done it before, regenerate his optic nerve to give him back at least
80%.
At 80% of his natural vision. And Jordy ultimately decides not to. But you having worked in ophthalmology and tissue transplantation and donation for such a long time, what did you think of this scene with Dr. Pulaski offering this kind of technology? What do you think it means for, if we had the technology in the future to do what she's offering to Jordy? What does it mean in terms of impacting the treatment of blindness?
We've this has come up in previous episodes, and there's slow but some definitive improvement in that technology, where you can take a prosthetic light sensing device and allow an electrical input into the occipital cortex of the brain, and an image can be seen. And right now it's a long way from normal vision. But the more we understand the brain and more we understand the technology related this, maybe something that like this would be possible in the future. And I think, my thought was that I think since Dr. Pileski really couldn't guarantee the outcome of the procedure she wanted to do, Jordy decided to keep the visor, put up with the pain, and so on. But because it wasn't a sure thing, but it made me think of some people who have inherited retinal diseases today, where they slowly go blind, and get to the point where all they have is light perception, can't see any images. There's now gene therapies being developed, and in some cases they've been successful. So if you're one of those patients and a gene therapy is developed where there's evidence from animals and whatever that would be successful, if you're losing your sight, what do you have to lose?
Right.
Jordy's not at that point.
So why do you think so for you it's wise for him to turn it down, because the chance of success is not, in your mind, worth the risk?
That's what I got from the conversation that Dr. Pulaski and Jordy had. Yeah.
So it also seems like Pulaski says that she's only done this twice.
I think it was 2 or 3 times, right?
It makes me wonder, like, in the future when it comes to doctors, because, whether it's Crusher or Pulaski or Julian Bashir on DS9 or the EMH on Voyager or Phlox on the original Enterprise or McCoy, of course, they often have to come up with treatments for diseases and all sorts of things that they come across in space. And it makes me wonder what kind of, not oversight, what kind of word am I looking for? Well, what kind of medical oversight that they're kind of under? Because if she's doing this with, like, if she's done this twice, that means she's done it with people that she's been like, I think I can do this.
Well, the way it works...
But is there anyone at Starfleet Medical who are like, oh yeah, Pulaski can do this? It's fine that she does this.
Based on how research works into new medical therapies.
Compliance, that's the word I'm looking for.
There should be an institutional review board that says, okay, you want to try this new therapy, and what data do you have from laboratory experiments or animal experiments that it's going to be effective, that it's going to be safe, that it's going to do no harm. And that issue just doesn't come up in Star Trek. But as you said, they are in situations where they're out in the galaxy, they come up with a new medical condition, and Bones or Phlox or Dr. Pulaski or Dr. Crusher, they need to use their medical knowledge. They don't have time to go to an institutional review board, and they have to come up with a way to solve it.
Right. Well, my thing about Pulaski offering to, like, regenerate his optic nerve is that, on one hand, like, you brought up, like, laboratory, what's your data? She has data on 2 people.
2 or 3.
2 or 3, but that's not enough to actually say, like, hey, Geordi, you're the chief engineer, let me do this risky surgery. The one thing that I can say that I think may help her get around that, and this goes into the question of future technology as it pertains to medicine, I think that since you have the Enterprise computer in the sickbay that is, this incredibly powerful AI that can do so much, I wonder if it actually runs the tests or runs the procedures or does the research for the medical professional before they make a decision.
It could be, it's not mentioned, it could be possible.
Well, like, I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, you got to this number of, like, 80% vision, like, but you only got that off of 3 people, so, like, how do you really know?
Right.
So, I think the easiest way to get around that is, like, she was running a model through the Enterprise computer to show her, like, but otherwise, it's just kind of fugazi.
Well, it's yeah, I mean, here's a real world situation. I talked to somebody just, I guess, earlier this week who says he had a macular degeneration, and his vision, he was legally blind, and his vision was improved so that he could get his driver's license after he had a bone marrow derived stem cell transplant. And, it's this clinic, it's kind of split between two states, and the researcher or the physician, the ophthalmologist who did this therapy on this guy, he is published, but he's only published in some rather obscure, low impact journals. Two of them are Chinese journals. They're in English, but
Okay.
the publisher's China.
Just before we go, we're not saying his name or.
No.
Okay.
I'm not saying his name at
Okay,
all.
good.
But, it's just, I have to talk to somebody about this, because one of the comments that was made is that, well, scientists get so entrenched in thinking certain ways that when somebody comes up with something new, they just can't jump to it. And there's a certain truth in that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there is,
Well, part of that's also dogmatism. Like if you're a scientist who's been, like, without naming names,
right,
but we know someone who was very pivotal in terms of the development of LASIK.
mm-hmm.
If that person has been doing LASIK for 30 years and then someone comes along and says, I've developed this new procedure, this new technology that completely does away with your industry, I could see people becoming very dogmatic about those kind of things.
Well, but the thing is, when somebody comes up with a completely revolutionary idea, if it's really good and there's enough data, there's more than 3 patients that shows that this really works, then it ought to translate over into, out of these obscure clinics into, mainstream medical that shows up at Duke, it shows up at Harvard, it shows up at Penn, and it's not happening in this case. So, the point you bring up is that, all right, Dr. Pulaski's done this 2 or 3 times. What is the data? Really show? Is that enough to show that this is really something that should be pursued, and so on? Which again probably makes Jordy's decision, since he's adapted well to the vision he has with the visor, even though it causes him pain, probably wise that he, decided to stick with it at this point.
Right. Well, I have to imagine that the amount of risk too, in space has, unless you knew, speaking for myself, if I was in the position where I was on a floating, not a floating, but if I was on the Enterprise and I knew that we were running the things every week where my life could be at stake, or I'm not necessarily sure that I would take the risk of such a huge surgery when, he's the chief engineer.
I was going to say that too.
Like,
right.
if something goes wrong, like, who do they replace him with on the fly?
Or what is he going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, does his Starfleet career end then even?
Right. Or what happens to her if something goes wrong?
Good question.
Right. So, kind of going back around, so we can wrap this up real quick. Our job, let's get back to the original question. Our job is not to police the galaxy. Without sounding kind of pedantic and short, what is the job then of the Federation? Is it only to police they're part of the Alpha Quadrant? Is it purely explorative? Like, if they're not the police force of the galaxy, what are they there for?
Well, it goes back to probably.
But this is a real question about sovereignty, because, like, why do we have a Coast Guard?
It probably goes back to that last episode of season 4 of Enterprise.
Right.
When, and we were talking about this the other day, that apparently there's some discussion of bringing back a season 5 of Enterprise to go into more detail.
Hopefully.
On how the Federation was formed. And of course, the original thing was that all of the adventures of Jonathan Archer on the NX-01 was dealing with the Vulcans and building trust between the humans and the Vulcans.
And the Andorians.
And then he made peace between the Vulcans and the Andorians, and the Tellarites came in and so forth. And, there seemed to be some groupthink like, now that, we're in proximity to one another and we're starting to trust each other, maybe what we need to do is form this federation and have some sort of organization to back it up in Starfleet so that there's, some collective security, collective, rules for trade between the different species, the different parts of the galaxy, that segment of the galaxy and so forth. Sort of like a NATO type thing, the whole idea there. So, but then, that doesn't answer the question of, well, what is the Enterprise's priority list? Is it a warship first? Is it an exploratory ship first?
Is it a medical ship?
Is it a medical ship? Is it the Coast Guard?
Because in many cases, in many episodes, they've had to serve the role of a medical ship, going to places where there's been pandemics or huge disasters.
So perhaps the answer is just that because it gives them, the writers, flexibility that they can call on it to do many, many different roles.
So it depends on the situation.
It depends on the story for that week.
Well, in that case, I think we've covered this story for this episode pretty well. We will see everyone again next time for Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 6, which is The Schizoid Man. Dad, thank you so much for joining me tonight, and hope to see you again.
And one little more fun fact is the actor that plays Harmony in this episode was married to John Delancey.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Well, on that, that is a pretty cool thing. So on that, we'll see you all later. Thanks, everyone.
Good night, Jay.
Night, Dad.